All right, so I see there are a few more people on the call. So I think we can safely start this 1-hour session. I'll start by mentioning a couple of things. So first of all, this is the second session for the data granularity BOF, and the one that is titled The User Perspective Data Citation Data Versioning. I have a couple of slides which I will be sharing with you shortly. This session is recorded, as you may have already seen on the top left of your Zoom screen. This means that, first of all, if anyone here is uncomfortable for having a recording, let me know and I'll stop it. At the same time, if you're fine with this session being recorded, but at the same time you don't want your face or anything else appear, just feel free to shut your video feed. So that's the first point. I'm pasting the link to the minutes Google document for those who joined later here. So you can go, there is a list, there's a table there, you can fill in your details and information that you feel comfortable sharing with. I also going to share you the link to the slides. I think you are able to have them, to access them as well. I'm putting it also on the Google, on the chat window. And I'll be sharing my screen in a second. Another point is to mention that this is an RDA session, which means that it falls under the RDA Code of Conduct. The link to the RDA Code of Conduct is actually linked to the minutes, so feel free to have a look. It's under the useful link section, point 4. Essentially what it says is to have a professional behavior and make other people feel comfortable. Don't make them feel uncomfortable. Be nice, play nice, and at the same time, if there are any problems, any issues, please feel free to let us know. If I or any of the co-chairs of this session make you comfortable, please reach out to the tab so as the issue will be resolved one way or another. So with these 2 points in place, let me start by sharing my screen now. I know that's going to, all right, there we go. Can everyone see my screen fine? Hopefully, yes.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, all good.
Perfect, thank you. Before we start, as there was a discussion earlier on about a lot of people that are, sorry, this is their first time in RDA. Could I have a quick round of hands? There is a function in the participant list. You can raise your hands if you like. A quick round of hands. Who is joining an RDA session for the first time? Okay, so my assumption is that everyone is quite familiar with RDA so far. So excellent. Good to have people actually joining this session again. And thank you for your time being here. So what is the purpose of this session? So this is a follow-up of a task force that is being around for about a year now under the context of the data discovery paradigm interest group. This is at P15, we proposed the first BOF of data granularity, but a longer discussion during a plenary took place in the context of the data discovery session in the Helsinki meeting. The focus of this BOF, apart from the granularity part, is to focus a bit on the user perspectives and in particular how data granularity can be perceived in terms of how a user might use this concept of data granularity when regarding data citation, data versioning, and so forth. So the first thing I want to mention now is, okay, sorry, I've already done that. The session notes, please sign in. So going through through the agenda first. I'll start with a short introduction. What is the issue? What is the situation? Why do we want or need to study the data granularity aspect from a user perspective? I'm going to go on with presenting a bit of the work that the data discovery task force has been doing in the past year or so. And then I want to dedicate the last essentially 30 minutes of the session to have a more in-depth discussion on what the next steps might have been. And I'll also try to report a few things that came up from the session, the first session that we had a few hours ago. So in terms of putting the, also at any time, if you want to stop me and discuss any aspect of that, please feel free to just raise your hand or unmute and cut me off. It's absolutely fine. So what is the purpose of this discussion? If we want to put this in context, if you look at the data and how you are producing, disseminating, discovering, using data in any context, these are changing all the time. And the way that data is stored in a repository, is indexed, is described by metadata, essentially dictates how the user is going to take advantage of that, and is connected to how granular this data is. For example, if a data set, and I'm using this set in quotation marks at this point because this is another part of discussion, is available only as a single dump, information dump, then it's quite possible that this is the only way that you can access that, regardless of if you want only a much smaller subset of this information. So defining this granularity can help also the user discover, access, and use essentially only the parts that are necessary for them, and also cite that in a sufficient manner. Also, it's an important point to highlight that granularity is not always constant. You may have different levels of granularity, different levels of organizing your data in subunits, depending on what stage of this dataset's life cycle you are. You might have a completely different level of granularity at creation and a completely different level at long-term archiving. And finally, if you look at the purely technical perspective, granularity has applications also in the services that utilize data. So for streaming data, ephemeral data, creating virtual data collections, and basically anything else that is relying on that. So focusing a bit on the discovery aspects, because if this essentially was spun as a task force under the data discovery paradigms interest group. When you look at data, they are commonly discoverable and accessible available data sets. And again, you're going to excuse the quotation mark around data set because this is a whole different discussion. The point here is that data sets often are essentially aggregates of observations, records, or files, or whatever the level of organization of this particular data set is. So if you look at discovery aspects, if you want to have an efficient and effective use of data, you want to be able to both assess the information here at a high level granularity. So for example, I want to retrieve all the data that is related to a particular feature of sampling that this data set was produced. And also by creating smaller subsets, you are able to associate persistent identifiers and metadata also at that level. So in a nutshell, if you want to have a more granular discovery and focus and retrieve information at a more detailed level, you also need to have to define this granular data access. So going to a bit forward to what is the timeline so far. This as an idea, as a topic, was first suggested by Kirsten Leonard at the Berlin plenary P11, where we officially initiated this task force under the data discovery paradigm interest group. The link to the task force statement is there, and Anna Milan, which was until very recently one of the most active members of this task force, led an unconference sanction in ESIP 2018 around this granularity and provided us with a lot of feedback on what happened there. In the next two plenaries, basically, we continue this discussion, having monthly telephone calls on this task force. Incidentally, the calls are always on the first Thursday or early morning of the Friday every month at 8 p.m. UTC, which is essentially the same time we are having, almost the same time we're having this discussion now. So this is almost the hour of where we set up the monthly calls. So for the next two plenaries, the discussion was always evolving around how to proceed, identify deliverables, and always looking for more volunteers to co-lead this task force. At P14, we had a more in-depth discussion during the data discovery session, where we had some additional perspectives coming in, especially from the fields of data repositories and how they envision data granularity could be used to provide services to data producers in order to store their data. So moving to what were the outcomes that so far we've been identifying, and would like to have a discussion on them today as well. So the first one is a reference, or if you would like it to call it a living document for data managers. So this, the concept we have about this is to have a set of use cases, a set of examples from different domains, different use cases of how data granularity is addressed in different cases from the data manager perspective, but always keeping in mind that this is going to be essentially used by the data user at the end. So this outcome, this live document, when we started, there is already a very small number of use cases where we identify in particular examples, what was the level of the granularity defined, why it was selected, and how users access the data at that particular level if need be, or other levels of granularity, levels of aggregation. The second outcome that we are considering is essentially, again, a type of reference document where we identify the types of questions to ask when you are trying to decide about the best level of granularity for your case. So this idea, this document is addressed to various stakeholders. It can range from the data producer, data curator, data repository, and data user. And all of those aspects connect to the question of, if I want to deposit data, what are the questions I need to address? If I want to access data, what are the questions I want to address? All of them around the granularity aspects. For this one, again, there is a draft document in place I'm going to be sharing with you in a second. So I start with the second document, which is the data granularity guidance. These are sort of the questions and practices, as well as templates, if you like, for data managers, data providers to define the best level of aggregation in order to ensure that a user's discoverability, the user's discovery or access or citation of the individual dataset is optimized. So this was essentially led by Robert Casey, Stephen Richard, Ilya Zaslavsky, and Ming Fan Wu. Some of them are all on this call, I think, if I saw the participants list correctly. And this started, as you can see from, so the link to the document is on the slide, so you can go look it up. And I think you should have access to it. And as you can see, this started in August last year, so a bit like 6 months ago. But this is still a work in progress, and we would like input in your feedback on that. And now we go to sort of a sticking point that we initiated also discussion during the morning session. I'll start by saying that these are definitions that I directly copied from the document that I shared with you. And a point is to discuss how you interpret these definitions. How do you feel about their applicability in the context that we're discussing right now? And more importantly, how do you feel that these particular definitions can be used to move forward in a sense of use them to establish a best practices document or recommendation document on how this can work in particular cases? So before I continue, are there any comments or questions so far? Let me see if I can see that. I'm not sure I can see the chat window. Can I? Oh yes, I can. All right, so there are no questions there. Any questions from any points, any thoughts?
Okay, so I'm going to bring up what I just put in the chat, which you probably haven't seen. But data is more than just observations. For example, I have several data sets that are compilations of journal articles, meeting some set of criteria, and then marked up journal articles. So, I mean, if you're doing, natural language processing or machine learning, that's a very common type of data.
You're absolutely right. I see also that Mark has a hand, I think. How I would also like, so this, we have the exact same discussion in the morning, and as you can see, there was some feedback on that, and we sort of tried to address that. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second because I want to go to the document with the minutes. If you scroll towards the end, we have the minutes of the first session. And one of the comments we got about that is basically from Andre Ferreira. And I'm going to copy this particular comment directly on the chat window here. And now check this again. Sorry, there we go. The reason I'm mentioning that, and the reason I pasted this on the chat window, is because the argument that we got at that time was exactly that. How do you define? Sorry, there you go. How do you define a data set? How you define what can be considered a data in different domains? And the point sort of we gravitated in the morning session was to use the ISO definition of what a data is, which I think includes also aspects like the ones that you just mentioned, if I'm really not mistaken. Okay, I see some points on the chat.
So this is Mark, if I could chime in here.
Yes, please do.
Hi, Mark Parsons, Rensselaer Polytechnic. You've hinted several times already, Fotis, that the whole question of what a data set and what data are is extremely fraught. And so I see, you're trying to put some bounds on that, but maybe we just need to be clear that these bounds are coming from, my impression is at least, an observationally based community. So, you know, ISO is the ISO specification is a geospatial metadata standard that's really commonly used, really broad, covers a vast array of data, but not everything. And so maybe we just need to, I mean, because we could get into a really big trap here, or maybe that's where you do want to go. Maybe you do want to get really meta and say, you know, what are we trying to say that data are broadly, and how do we chunk that up? Or are you really trying to focus on observations? And maybe just make that clear up front. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And I definitely don't want to go into the itty-gritty parts of trying to find a definition that I don't really expect to come up with anything that everyone will be happy at. Basically, at some point in the morning, we come up with a discussion, data is data, and we left it at that. Because, I mean, it's extremely hard to come with a definition that everyone will be behind it. At the same time, I don't want to focus a lot on the actual definition of the data, but rather move towards the concept of the granular, and hopefully through that go to data back again if need be. So I'm moving a bit to the data part now, to the granular part. So the granular here is the definition we sort of gravitate to, is the smallest aggregation of data that can be independently managed. And independently managed here is, again, by this particular definition, described, inventoried, retrieved. I would also add cited, and based on the discussion we had in the morning, also not sustained, but it can stand by its own. I think that was, I'm not really sure if that's a correct term, but I hope you get my point here. So the question is it possible to identify this granular and connecting this to a particular activity that I would like to have as a discussion? If we agree that a granular is defined as such, and this is a big if, I know that, would it be possible to come up with a set of guidelines, recommendations, best practices, if that doesn't work, for a user or for a data manager to take into consideration when storing data or when depositing data, to define this as part of the metadata of the data set? Too complex of a question? Any thoughts on that?
Esther has her hands up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot see the hands for some reason. But please do. Why don't I see the hands?
Oh, because I'm the host.
Ah, sorry, my
Sorry,
bad.
I didn't watch it.
And I was hoping to see hands. Right, so please go ahead.
Was that Esther? I don't see that.
Ah, yeah, I think Esther also put things on the chat. I didn't raise my hand, so that's probably why you don't see my raised hand. Okay, fair enough. All right, so there are some points on the chat that I see here. So first point is, okay. First point is Granularity needs to consider the confidentiality and privacy requirements of the data too. I'm not really sure. I of course don't disagree with that. My question here is mostly if there is confidentiality privacy requirements for the data itself, why wouldn't they be applicable to any parts of the data? So if there is a confidentiality or a privacy statement for the entire data set, if I take a subset of that, it's quite possible that the same requirements stand for that. Is this not correct? I'm not an expert in these aspects, so excuse me if this is a very naive question. Fair enough. It could be a software issue. I can imagine that. All right. So let me go back to my original question then, and I will go back to the definition. All right. There's a point here by Claire. Aggregation removes confidentiality issues, so at higher levels of granularity, it is not an issue. Okay. I see your point. So if you're looking for medical records, for example, if you have a single record, this is definitely an issue with privacy and confidentiality. If you have the aggregate of that, you essentially don't have this aspect. But at the same time, I feel that if there are any privacy issues with a single record, if you have all the records, it's the same issue, because if it contains the names instead of having one, you can have all the names or something along those lines. So aggregation, in that sense, I interpret it as the fact that instead of having the actual data, you have the aggregate description of the data, which is a different point. And I'm not suggesting that we go towards this direction, but mostly to go back towards the concept of if any data set, if we have a use case where a data set is submitted, or let me try it in a different way. I'll try with an example that I can sort of think of from my background, which is in life science and bioinformatics. Let's say I have 4 different repositories, and I want to curate a new data set that contains some parts of repository A, some parts of repository B, C, and D, and so forth. At the end, what I'm going to produce is something that I personally curated, but at the same time, I want to be able to cite the particular subsets I retrieved from each of these repositories. So I have 2 levels of formation there. You have in the new data set I produced, I should have a persistent identifier that connects to my curated data set. But at the same time, the individual parts that I have retrieved from the individual repositories should also cite the particular repositories because I retrieved them for them. And it would make more sense to cite the particular parts of the data that I'm using instead of citing the entire repository, because this obfuscates in my mind what exactly I'm using for a repository. So if I extract information of an entire experiment that is done and contains hundreds of samples, and I want to extract 2 of them, it doesn't make sense to yes. And here I have Mark comment on the chat window to use the RDA recommendation for cite dynamic data. Thank you. I think this was raised also in the morning as something that we should have as an immediate activity following up this task force, including 2 more working groups that I think I have in a minute somewhere. I'm not obviously familiar with what the recommendation is. I didn't have the time in between the sessions to look it up. So my question is, how would this be connected to the granular problem that we are discussing right now, if you are familiar with that?
Yeah, I am. This is Mark again. I'm actually the co-chair of the working group, which, but it's really been Andy Rauber's work from Austria and his colleagues. The working group wrapped up several years ago, and we've just been in maintenance mode since then. But the basic principle is that you're putting a persistent identifier on a query. so that you maintain the infrastructure in a way that you can always repeat a particular query to a collection. And so in a sense, it's looking at granularity in a different way. I mean, I think there's definitely concerns of granularity from a management function of how the data, were originally created and how they're stored. But from a user perspective, you might be slicing and dicing a collection or a data set in a variety of different ways. So the data cube concept in Earth observations, for example. Or I thought it was really interesting, the discussion in the chat that confidentiality begins to define the level of granularity. If you don't have appropriate permissions, you can't access a certain level of granularity. So that's wandering a bit from the RDA recommendation, but I think the RDA recommendation does address the particular question of how do you reference a particular subset of a rapidly or of a changing data set. It doesn't address all the questions of granularity, but I think it does address that one.
All right, thank you. That is useful to understand. And as you said, it definitely connects to the granularity part. So moving from there, if there is again, I need to go through the recommendation actually to have an informed opinion on that. My question is based on the description that you just gave on using and citing essentially the query which you retrieve that. In my mind, this sort of enforces two things. One, that you actually have a query that you can refer to, unless query could be pretty much even a link that you use, not necessarily query by itself. So for example, a link to the file that is located under a particular repository does not necessarily mean that you can have a query that leads you to it. And second, from the data producer perspective, it means that they cannot have information about what parts of the data are used. In addition, if the parts of the data that should be used together, because these are the minimal aggregates that can be used in any meaningful context as per the data producer, are used in a correct way. So I can cut bits and pieces of a data set to retrieve exactly what I want, but at the same time, this might not necessarily reflect what was the original aspect that the data involved at that particular entry. Am I making any sense? Or
yeah, you're totally making sense, but that's not a problem that this recommendation tries to solve. We're just trying to provide a precise reference to the data used, and evaluating whether that was used appropriately is a completely different matter.
Right. I'm sorry. It's a bit. So my mind is a bit mushy. So I was not criticizing the recommendation, not asking whether the actual recommendation supports that. I was wondering if that could be an extension of the recommendation in order to connect to the granular discussion we're having right now. And my understanding from your answer is that this might be indeed a viable direction. Also, the comment of whether the use is appropriate or not. I'm not. I don't know. I know how the rest of the participants here feel. If that would be a useful aspect to include in the granular definition. So right now, as you can see, the definition focuses more on what can be independently managed in terms of description, inventory, and retrieval. That does not imply appropriateness, at least in my mind. But if you feel that this is something that is useful, we can include that in the part of the definition. Comments, thoughts? Okay.
I don't have an answer to that question, Fotis, but I think maybe what you're, to get more sort of meta on you again, is I think granular is defined differently by the people who are stewarding the data than the people who are using the data. You're coming in with a use purpose, you're thinking about what you need, you're stewarding the data, you think about how the data is already structured, how you received it. Sometimes, you know, the structure is predefined, sometimes you get to change it, sometimes you're putting it into a database, sometimes you're storing it as just a collection of files that are already predefined. And so I think it's a, you know, how granular is defined there is very different from that. It's sort of a use case thing, I guess.
No, I don't disagree. Okay, so I have to find a way to be efficient with that. Right. So this is the point that you raised, that the granularity is completely different depending on how you perceive it, and I completely agree with that. And this is one of the issues that I was hoping to have a focus of in this task force. So, for example, if we look at this under the context of the data discovery, right? So the focus is how to optimize discovery of data by a user. As a data manager, I'm not the data manager, so you can take this with a grain of salt. If I want my data to be quickly and efficiently accessed by my potential users, it would make sense for me to structure the data in the form of the granules that would be more appropriate for their particular use, for the intended use in that sense. So although granularity will have different definitions based on whether I'm going to do it in a repository or as a curator or anything else for that matter, it would also mean that there should be at least one alignment between the definition that is used from all sides so that you can ensure this sort of optimization. Because if the user wants really to have access to a particular data set through X granular and you have structured your entire data set in a completely different way, it means that you're going to have additional effort in either side to actually support this sort of interaction. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So you're trying to sort of harmonize as best you can those two views as to, you know, what's a chunk of data.
Right. And so these are the basically this also connects to the outcomes that we're discussing. So one of the outcomes, I have too many windows open right now. I hope you only see the screen with the slides. Otherwise, you're going to be super confused. I am. So these are the two outcomes. And the one that also Anna Milan started with the rest of the chairs there is to actually have this sort of what other people are doing, the use cases, and based on then try to identify what would be this particular connection. I'm trying to flip this into a different case. What if we can identify what would be the questions that we need to have in place, and what would be the best practice that we need to have in place so that these use cases are going to be aligned to the expected use. So as a task, so first of all, does this make sense as an activity, as a task, as an effort? Because I want to make sure that we identify also some actions for the next steps. Okay, I have one vote of confidence, that's good. Are there any other thoughts around the room? Okay, fair enough. All right, so in that sense, and I'm trying to echo also the discussions we had this morning about this. Another point that I raised was because it was also a goal of this both during the plenary to discuss whether the participants on the session feel that this should move forward as a working group or whether it should stay within the context of that discovery as a task force. I'll start by saying what was the consensus in the first session, and I want to have your opinion on that as well. The consensus is that given that working groups need to have a tangible outcome within 18 months, and we are still largely in the exploration phase, it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually have a working group on that. That being said, we can still maintain it as a task force under data discovery, and would definitely encourage more people to join the task force, and if interested, of course, actually take a leading role in making this happen. So that was the decision for session 1. Okay, so Mark has a comment here that working groups have more overhead, but the results of yours more authoritative. So yes, the point was to continue for the next 6 months as a task force and revisit this around the time of the next plenary, possibly either as a both, again under the same context, or a session under data discovery. We'll see how this can be done in the actual in practice. And based on the point that we have reached until then, we discuss whether a new working group can be instantiated with a clear outcome at the end, or whether we should stick to the task force and live with that. Data discovery, the interest group has already a few outputs produced, not RDA outputs in the formal sense, but more like supporting documents, I think it's the term, or supporting outputs, which are, so we do have the option of going for a white paper, for example, through this effort. But given the issue of the granularity that sort of seems to stick around by a lot of people, in the morning session we had 33 participants all in all. I assume that this is something that more people would like to move forward. So going back to the action. So the first decision/action was to stick this up still as a task force until the next plenary and continue work with that. The second action, I think I've put those here as well somehow. Okay, let me try to see if I can see my own slides. The second point is to start compiling the recommendations of other working groups within RDA. And the point here is for people who already joined these 2 sessions to offer any recommendations that they have on working groups, especially on activities and recommendations like the one that Mark mentioned earlier, that we can directly build upon and continue with them. And if you have any use cases, we also have the suggestion to connect to the use cases group there in order to start collating them more efficiently in identifying the key points. Is there someone wants to add something? Okay, there's a version group. Yes, please, Ming.
Fortress is Ming here. I regards to the use cases, can make suggestion, because there are lots of user cases there. If you follow this link, can we start user case document ourselves to collect user cases about granularity. In the end, we can submit all those user cases to, add that to the RDA user cases group. Otherwise, we have to constantly check which user cases is about the data granularity. So that's basically we did for the data versioning working group. We handle documents, a user case document, we collect 39 user cases. When we finish, we just submit those user cases to this group.
Fair enough. That sounds like a reasonable plan. I think we already have some sort of document like that within the task force that captured a few use cases. I think Ruth added a few of them in that. So we might as well continue with that and submit them all together as you suggested. So that's a good point. So these are the main actions that I got from the morning session. So are there any additional suggestions here as to how we should move forward, or any other thoughts on activities that we should be taking in the next 6 months? Okay. I assume that everyone is sort of happy with how things are defined. Yes, the plan is to continue with the regular monthly meetings. I would strongly suggest, if you're interested in joining that, to join the Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group. The link is right on the top of the minutes of the Google document. Because I always send a reminder a week before and a few days before the actual call to remind people of the agenda and the time and the connection. Okay, yes, the minutes is okay. I'm not sure I can do that right now. Mingfang, can you please paste the URL of the Google Doc to the minutes? Sorry, to the chat. Sorry. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ming. So if you go to the top, the data discovery link is there. You can click. If you're already registered on RDA, you should log in, and you're going to find the button of joining the group there. I sent the emails to that, plus any other people from outside the RDA that are interested in doing that. I also try to keep that. I see a comment from Reina here about keeping this as a working group, both Esther and Reina actually. They do, I agree that working groups have more concrete action deadlines, but at the same time, my understanding is that the point we are right now in this granularity task force, although there is a definite issue of having it as a working group, the actions and the deadlines, the expected actions and the corresponding deadlines cannot be easily identified. And also working groups will require people who actually want to drive this with much more energy than me in this particular instance, and Mingfang and Siri Joda, who are co-chairing also the interest group. So that, I think that was mostly the rationale of having that. And yes, having drivers is a good point. Yes, thanks Mark. I try to do that. Not always easy to say no though. So with that in mind, I'll try to copy all the minutes here, all the chat to the minutes to keep them as well. And oh, thanks, Leila. So with that, if there are not any other points or any other questions, comments, thoughts I would like to share. I would like to, okay, I can take on more. This one for as a working group. All right. So.
Oh, if you have a champion, you have to run with it. Go, Reina, go.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to work with you, Reina, to actually start drafting a working group chapter about this, charter about this.
Maybe I'll just speak on like kind of what I'm thinking, where it fits in for me. So we recently are just at the finishing stages of actually implementing the data citations guidelines that Mark was referring to from the data citations working group. And we made our own decisions on what is a data set, but now we're working towards the idea also about collections and what represents a collection. So that relationship between a data set, granule, and collection is really fundamental to some of the projects I have going on this year. For instance, we're working on a project with the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System where we've defined a data set to be one deployment of one device. But then we have to have ways of aggregating them as collections too, and then for easier delivery to users, and also as a way to more easily cite the data in some cases. So that sort of those relationships are really, I think, important, especially to get it in a way that the community agrees on, because we have to be interoperable with other ocean data providers. So this is something we think is really important to explore soon, especially as more groups become, try to be more integrated and interoperable with each other.
Sorry, I was muted. So that's actually an excellent idea. I see also that Esther is interested in that as following. So if you want to take an active role in that and sort of pursue this, I know that there are a lot of people interested in that, but so far there were very few who actually could take an active role in that, a more active role in that. And as I mentioned, neither me, Norman Fang, or Syriza that could actually push this as much as we should have, because we are, speak for myself, I'm stretched a bit too thin to be able to fully commit to a working group. So the question I would like to pose here is, having a working group, from the concept from the first session was to continue as a task force, but if you want to start discussing about a professional working group, I'm more than happy to assist and put these together. But again, I can only take a secondary role in that. I don't know if anyone else on this call is interested, and I'm also more than happy to make a connection to the people who joined the first session and have a discussion on that, mentioning that you are interested in leading a working group. What do people think here in this call, and you right now, of course?
Just a comment for photos. This task force granularity started with think all data types, all type of data from start. If we start a working group, if that scope is too big, and most of leading people say from working for ocean data or something like that, we could limit the scope to one, or I'm not sure how that will work out with RDA. If you could define the scope to one or two domains for a start, that probably easier for working group, have more concrete outcome to deliver.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Like or maybe not just in oceans, but maybe I know there was some debate about the definition of data being observational or whatnot, but maybe if it was just limited to that concept of the observational in terms of, you know, measurements or something like that, as a use case, which is still pretty broad.
My understanding of the working group is, yeah, go ahead, Ming-Fan, sorry.
So the outcomes photos to suggest outcome for the working group photos shown before is more generic. Say that's why say outcome is a checklist instead of the, you know, procedure guideline. So what you should do, how to manage your granularity, but as a principle to guide the decision to what granularity level you one should to decide on. So that's be generic. I'm not sure if as a working group still able to do that, then sorry, and two options here. One is still go generic, but use specific discipline as a use cases to check that principles or checklist, or purely go to the discipline focused. Have a guideline for that discipline. So just comment or suggestion.
Well, again,
For the working group, usually you should have adoption use cases. So, so you, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. A working group, I've seen a lot of working groups that are very, very specific, domain specific. And if you have a recommendation that is defined for a particular domain, then you can have adoption stories of how this particular recommendation was adapted for another domain. So I think it does make sense. Going back to my original question, Reina, would this be okay if I send an email to people who participate in these two sessions saying that you're interested in putting together a working group, but looking for a co-chair or co-chairs in order to do that? And is anyone else interested in this call to be a co-chair with Reina on this?
Yeah, I'd be fine with that.
Fair enough. So, okay, so I can do that, definitely. So I think we are on the hour. Are there any other thoughts, comments, ideas you'd like to share? All right, if not, thank you all for joining. I think it was an productive and definitely interesting discussion. I wish you all a good night or good day or good afternoon, wherever you are in this world. And please do stay safe. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fortis. Have a good rest.
You too. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
So
I will copy the chat.
okay.
So don't worry.
Thank you. Thank you. That would be very useful.
Okay.